All right. Good morning, everyone. If you're here for the panel discussion on disinformation, propaganda in Taiwan, threats, you're in the right place. If you're not, please feel free to stay and enjoy the conversation that we're about to have. So I'm Russell Shah. I'm the Executive Director of the Global Taiwan Institute. I'll be the chair of this session. And earlier, as I was talking about the importance of the connection between academic research and policy, I'm very delighted to be able to chair this discussion and learn from the very relevant research that these researchers are engaged in on disinformation and propaganda and threats. And especially in recent years with regards to the influence operations that the PRC is engaged in Taiwan and across the world. I think there is a high degree of interest with regards to not only the sort of operational side of the types of activities that we see China engaged in Taiwan and across the world, but also the theoretical and historical analogies that we can find to draw lessons from to better inform how to respond to these types of challenges. And so we're going to hear from four very knowledgeable academics and researchers about the various issues, and I will introduce them just briefly in the order that they will be speaking. First, we'll have Denisa Herbertova from the Department of Chinese Studies at Masaryk University in the Czech Republic, and she'll be talking about Taiwan in propaganda versus Taiwan in underground literature, the role of Taiwan in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War, and followed by Scott Radnitz and Yuan Shao, both from the University of Washington, Seattle here. And they will be talking about how domestic divisions shape perceptions of foreign disinformation, evidence from Taiwan and Ukraine. They will be followed by Lev Nachman from the Fairbanks Center for Chinese Studies at Harvard University. And finally, we will close with a presentation from Jesse Liu from National Tsinghua University in Taiwan. So I'll turn it over now to Denisa.
Thank you. So good morning, everyone. Thank you for deciding to stay here on this panel. And I'll try to keep it to the allotted time. But to be honest, when I was looking through my slides at the PowerPoint presentation this morning, I went, I think, a little bit overboard with the amount of pictures I wanted to share with you. Therefore, through some slides, I probably just gonna run through. Well, this is actually a research that is still kind of in its early stages, and I was kind of surprised itself to find that there was a huge amount of propaganda about Taiwan in Czechoslovakia during the Cold War. It's quite understandable why it was surprising. Taiwan is obviously quite far away. I mean, geographically, not that many people would be able to visit Taiwan before the Cold War. So why the amount of propaganda that was going on? And why there is a connection with the dissidents or the underground literature. It's quite obvious. If you have a huge amount of propaganda on something, definitely your opposition is going to pick up on that and later on use it in certain ways. So let's find out. So what is the research background and the questions? I'm going to probably tackle only just it partially, as I said, the time limitations. So I'm going to focus on only certain aspects. So I'm going to shortly introduce you to the propaganda what was during the Cold War about Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang. So we will just have a little bit of overview about that. And then I'm going to introduce the Czechoslovak dissidents and what did they write about the same issue, and obviously what it resulted into. So first, I'm gonna, oh, I see that the slides didn't fit in properly. But anyway, we will first focus, as I said, on the propaganda narrative. So I'm gonna show you a lot of pictures. We will not go through through each of them in detail because the amount of those propaganda posters and cartoons is actually quite staggering. I'm actually working only with 3 periodicals that were published during the Cold War in Czechoslovakia, and that is just to show you that actually this is only in the 3 of them. Obviously, the amount of propaganda was much bigger. So I'm gonna tackle Rudé právo, which is something like Pravda in the Soviet Union, the biggest propagandistic newspapers that was published daily during 1948, which was the time when the communists in Czechoslovakia took over the country, until the 1989, when we had Velvet Revolution and the fall of communism. So as you can see, actually the time frame works quite well with what was going on in Taiwan. As obviously Kuomintang came to Taiwan right after the Second World War, but Chiang Kai-shek fled to Taiwan in 1949, so just 1 year between our communist takeover and the start of democratization process in 1987. And the 2 other periodicals I'm gonna cover is Dikobraz and Roháč, and those 2 were actually those periodicals that were very popular and the most read, simply because those were cartoons and just focusing on this kind of light entertainment, which meant that people were able to find, hidden messages and information within those cartoons if they were very well politically aware. Those 3 periodicals, not only that they were published, one of them on daily basis, the 2 of them on a weekly basis or 2-week basis, depending on the period, but there were many of them circulated for free, and very often pages from those periodicals were provided on for free in workplaces, schools, hospitals. So actually, it tackled and attached and pretty much the whole population of Czechoslovakia was very well aware what was published there. The peak of propaganda, the highest amount of propaganda on Taiwan, Chiang Kai-shek, and Kuomintang in general was between 1949 and 1953. That was something I'm going to show you in a second, a graph, so you can get a better picture by looking at numbers. But in the decades afterwards, it was slowly declining. But it doesn't mean the issue was left on the side completely. There were certain topics that were periodically reminded to the population. And actually, as I found out, it was from direct orders from Moscow. They actually told to the Czechoslovak communists how often to cover that topic, and actually what kind of artists should create those propagandistic cartoons. And it was a very important thing, because when you are starting to create some kind of propaganda about a new topic, you need to develop also a very understandable picture that everybody can relate to. Something when they will see from a distance and they're gonna know, oh, this is Chiang Kai-shek, oh, this is Kuomintang soldier. And one of the leading artists on it was Lev Haas, who was a Jewish cartoonist who survived the Second World War. His actually life is super amazing, and his life would definitely make a great story for a Hollywood movie. But this is obviously an issue for maybe a coffee break. But he was so good that he was released from prison, and his Jewishness was forgiven for time period, because unfortunately anti-Semitism was still present, and he created an lasting image of Chiang Kai-shek. We will see that in the first pictures, or the cartoons that were published in the late 1940s, Chiang Kai-shek is often portrayed as a little bit chubby, to resemble Uncle Sam, his American, co-worker or counterpart. But through the years, actually, he became this like very skinny figure with huge teeth, really tiny eyes. And that was actually an image that was later on taken by other cartoonists, for example, in Poland or even in other communist parties in the West, like, for example, in France. So now we have a little, very short preliminary table of the propaganda that was published about it. But this table actually has plenty of issues, and I'm going to have to work on it further on. I focused only on the coverage that was actually on the title of those magazines, or it actually covered the whole page. But obviously, as you can imagine, there were plenty articles or small pictures that were on the side through those newspapers. So those are only the titles or full coverage propaganda posters or cartoons. And that actually says a lot. So in those years, from 1949 to like 1951, 52, Taiwan issue, Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang was the second highest covered international topic in Czechoslovakia communist propaganda, which itself is quite staggering. It was taken over later on by Korean War, quite understandably, but this just tells you how important it was. And this actually is a very important point to remember for future reference. Because of that, a lot of people were very familiar with Taiwan and its history, even though the presented history was very twisted, but they knew about Taiwan. And this quite wide public knowledge about Taiwan actually remained in Czechoslovakia and right now Czech Republic until these days, compared to countries, for example, to the West, like Germany. So now we are going to the fun part when I'm going to show you a bunch of pictures. Here you can see that Chiang Kai-shek, even though he's already having a bigger teeth, quite big teeth, he is still not very skinny, or he's able to run. He still is quite capable, even though running away from a strong communist soldier. What was obviously a big part, and it was even covered, but in the textbooks, was that obviously Taiwan was and will remain a part of China. And I can see that my time is like really running, so I'm gonna speed up a little bit. We can see that in the newspapers, there were also like some kind of historical manipulation that was later on adopted by textbooks. I didn't have time to go through all the textbooks in the time framework, but this is my plan for the future. So they were obviously highlighting 228 incident as something that was like the rise of Taiwanese people against Kuomintang and therefore against Americans. But they had very twisted information, as you can see. They didn't really bother with even the basic facts, like when the Japanese came to the island. Through the years now, you can already see that Chiang Kai-shek is now shrinking in size. He's becoming very skinny, and that should obviously highlight his useless efforts in taking over the mainland China. The issue of American financial support was highly covered, and it was a great laugh about it. Obviously, Chiang Kai-shek lost even with the huge financial and military support from the United States. The brave Chinese soldiers defeated him. So that was something that was on purpose highlighted by the communist parties around the world to show actually that right now is the time when communism is going to take over the world like a flame, because see what the Chinese were able to do. So Chiang Kai-shek obviously is in a sinking period, and even the US can't do anything about it. We have to mention on the other side that common KMT soldier was portrayed always as the naive victim, because obviously they wanted later on to incorporate the KMT soldiers back into the Chinese, Taiwanese, and communist nations. So they didn't want to divide those groups. But this issue is quite understandably, and you can guess it yourself, an issue that was covered until the 70s, until the PCR became a member of the United Nations. So that was one of the topics that was covered through the following decades, even after the amount of propaganda kind of decreased. Through the years, also, Chiang Kai-shek stopped being portrayed even as a person. He became a dog, so he even lost his human characteristics. And you can see that actually they were trying to circulate the propaganda through different nations. So you can see that even Czechoslovak newspapers started to take over pictures from abroad. So the victory was quite understandably inevitable. Communists will win. And just a very quick overview of this part. 228 incident, Taiwanese were supported. The incident was about Taiwanese supporting their comrades on mainland. That was the main issue. What was happening there at 228 incident and the peak of propaganda we mentioned. And now a little bit to the dissident literature. What happened then? Obviously, in every authoritarian regime, we have quite a lot of dissidents. They have to publish secretly. And what is important to distinguish is the dissidents who were publishing and writing their works abroad, and they were smuggling them back behind the Iron Curtain, or those who were actually living in Czechoslovakia of writing about it. So obviously those two groups distinguish quite severely in their views. And because the time pressure, I'm gonna slide to the comparison what was going on abroad and what was going back home, is that actually those who were living abroad were mostly people, immigrants who immigrated from Czechoslovakia, and actually very often were able to visit Taiwan, especially in the 70s and later in the 80s. And they were able to observe the Taiwanese economic miracle, and they were able to observe the start of the democratization process in the 80s. On the other side, back home, quite understandably, people had information only from those dissidents abroad, or from what they were able to read in other smuggled literature. Therefore, their perception was different. So those who were living abroad believed that what should happen in Czechoslovakia was that through an economical success, democratization is gonna happen, and that should be the direction to actually focus on the economical part. But on the other side, back home, what people believe and what kind of information they got was that Chiang Kai-shek was a beloved member of the Taiwanese society, unlike his father, who was hated. This was the portrayal. And therefore, Communist Party of Czechoslovakia should start to hire more people like Chiang Kai-shek, and they would start the democratization process. So even though obviously the propaganda at the beginning was to create a hate towards American and Chiang Kai-shek, actually through the decades, in retrospect, it kind of hit the Czechoslovak communists in their back, and quite the opposite happened. Obviously, Americans were not hated. Whatever was American was good and much better than Soviet. But Chiang Kai-shek, the son of Chiang Kai-shek, the so-called hated figure, actually became very popular and was looked up to and seen as someone to follow. So Taiwan actually became kind of a leading example for the dissidents back home. So thank you very much. My time is over, and I will be very happy to answer any of your questions.
Well, thank you very much, Denisa. That was a fascinating presentation, and I look forward to the Q&A so that we can engage more on your research on that. Next, we'll have Scott Ratnitz and Yun Xiao to talk about how domestic divisions shape perceptions of foreign disinformation evidence from Taiwan and Ukraine. Yun, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Russell. So how do I start the PowerPoint? Oh, perfect. Can people in the back hear me? Very good. All right, thanks for coming to this presentation. So as you see, we're talking about disinformation claims. This is joint work between myself and Dr. Scott Ratnitz, who is also in the audience. We're very honored to have him join us. I'm an assistant professor from the Department of Communication at the University of Washington, and Scott is an associate professor of Jackson School of International Studies, also at the UW. So here's kind of the overview of how I envision this presentation. I'll start with the background, followed by the data, methods, results, and implications. So today's focus is Taiwan. I know in the booklet it says Taiwan and Ukraine. This is a cross-national project. The way we envisioned it when we proposed the proposal is we're thinking about this internationally. We have superpower producers of disinformation like Russia and China. And we have countries that are affected by these disinformation claims, like Taiwan and Ukraine. So that was what we originally proposed. Then Russia actually invaded Ukraine, which prevented us from collecting data over there. So today I'll focus on the Taiwan results, but it's an ongoing project. And if you contact us in a couple of months, we will have data from Georgia, another state that is heavily influenced by Russia. And we'll also have data from the United States. The basic framework is the same, although whether the results will be same, we don't know yet. Let's first talk about disinformation. What is disinformation? Let's define the terms. For us, the idea of disinformation is false content that is intentionally spread. So if it's unintentionally or people have no knowledge that it's false, we call it misinformation. That's not the big thing we're going to talk about here. We're talking about disinformation. It's intentional, it's strategic, and it's aimed to influence politics in a country. Who are the disinformation spreaders? They can be domestic, they can be foreign. Politicians within a country, they spread disinformation, trying to manipulate public opinion. On the other hand, we are increasingly seeing foreign interventions of disinformation. Places like Russia, China have their internet research agencies generating a lot of propaganda, going back to the previous presentation, also trying to influence other countries. And that's what we're interested in, both domestic and foreign sources of misinformation and how people see them. So to bring Taiwan in context, let's look at this plot produced by the VDEM Digital Society Project and then reproduced by 菜市场政治学 on the countries that are targeted the most by foreign disinformation operations. Guess what's on the top? Taiwan. And then next we have other countries. Taiwan is one of the most targeted countries of disinformation foreign operations. Now let's move on a little bit and get into a little bit of a nuance. Disinformation and disinformation claims, which are different. In countries where disinformation is prevalent, disinformation claims are also prevalent. What does that mean? That means we define disinformation claims by accusing or saying that something is a disinformation. Now, this has multiple purposes. It can be used to fact check false information. For example, if somebody spreads disinformation, you can say this is disinformation and trying to correct their false beliefs. That is often a benefit to society. It exposes the truth and refutes false claims. But also, disinformation claims can be used to muddle the truth. When people present truthful information, other people can use claims of disinformation to say, well, that's actually not the truth, it's disinformation, and then the public gets confused. We see this in a lot of places, including in the United States, where Breitbart News wields claims that the New York Times or CNN, when reporting truthful information, are actually fake news. President Trump often says that something is fake news. It's a double-edged sword, in other words. Which brings us to our research topic. We want to understand how people respond to these disinformation claims, how receptive people are to these claims, and what are the factors that affect people's receptivity to disinformation claims. Specifically, we look at two things. One, who makes the disinformation claim? Who is saying that something is disinformation? That is the claimer. The other thing is, who is the accused source of disinformation? Who do we say produces disinformation? That is the source. Which brings us to our research questions. Question one, does exposure to disinformation claims actually reduce confidence in information? Maybe there's a lot of claims out there and actually nothing changes. That's something we want to look into. Second question is, how does the effect of disinformation claim differ by who the claimer is? The claimer effect that I just mentioned. And finally, how does the effect of disinformation claim differ by who is the accused source of disinformation? Whether we say disinformation is from Russia, disinformation is from China, disinformation is from malicious politicians. We want to look into these claims about different sources. Which brings us to our data and our design. We collect data on 2,400 Taiwanese residents, with, in general, a representative sample based on gender and age, and to some degree, education. And we apply this method of a vignette survey experiment. Now, some people know what it is, some people do not. So let me try to explain what it is. It's basically a survey where respondents read a hypothetical scenario and answer what they would do in that scenario. Just like, what would you do if blah, blah, blah? You know, that kind of thing. Except each respondent receives a slightly different scenario. Some people read the scenario, some people read that scenario, and that is the experimental part. We want to see how people respond differently to different hypothetical scenarios, and that's the treatment. Going back to how we incorporate this into our experiment, how do we incorporate disinformation claims into experiment? We do a two-stage experiment where people read something and then read something else sequentially. In the first stage, we have the original news information. And this is actually the text that people read. Imagine you are reading news on the internet and come across the following article. It alleges that a prominent candidate for president in Taiwan was caught engaging in illegal gambling and was once responsible for a car accident that killed a child. It goes on to provide additional details, including interviews and photos. The author writes that this is an important but overlooked study. Okay, so you read this original news article. Then we go to stage two, which is the exposure to that original article, claiming that that original article is false information, it's disinformation. So here's the text. A claimer, and I'm going to talk about what the claimer is, the claimer blank says that after careful research, it was determined that the article you just saw is an example of disinformation spread by disinformation source and is full of factual errors. He says readers should approach it with caution. So this is claiming that the stage one news is actually disinformation. But as I said, the beauty of a vignette survey experiment is that each respondent reads a slightly different version. For some respondents, they would see different types of claimers. Some people see a DPP spokesperson, a KMT spokesperson, an NGO spokesperson, or a reporter from a major newspaper. We also vary the disinformation source, the Chinese government, the Russian government, or malicious politicians. Let me give one example of how one respondent may see. A DPP spokesperson says that after careful research, blah, 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 blah. The article you just saw is an example of disinformation spread by the Chinese government. So each person reads a slightly different text. If you have further questions, I can explain more in the Q&A. After stage one, we ask respondents about how much they believe in the news article's claim. So that was before people were exposed to disinformation claims, how much do they believe in the original news article? After stage two, respondents were asked about how much they still believe in the original news article claim. Do you still believe it? If somebody says that this is disinformation spread by the Chinese government, does that lower your trust in the accuracy of the original news article? We also asked about who the president voted for in the 2020 presidential election. We broadly characterized by pan blue, which is pro-KMT, or pan green, which is leaned towards the DPP's ideological stance. Right. So there are a lot of results. You can read more in the paper. But let me just highlight a couple of them that are directly related to our research question. First, we find that any claim of disinformation lowers trust in the original article's claim. Oh, there's actually no, I thought there was going to be animation. Okay, anyway, look at the red bar. That is stage one. Stage one says, which is before exposure to disinformation claims, people generally have a higher level of trust in the original article's claim, but any claimer, well, actually any exposure to disinformation claim significantly lowers the trust in the original news article. So this actually works. Saying that somebody is disinformation lowers the trust in the original claim. Let's take a look at the disinformation source. Does it really matter if somebody says this is disinformation from China versus disinformation from Russia or disinformation from malicious politicians? What we find is, yeah, you can see it say it's statistically significant, but it's not substantively significant. The levels are pretty similar. Let me explain this plot. So each on the x-axis, you have different sources of disinformation. On the y-axis is how much the trust is lowered. So you can see these three dots, and they are pretty much at a similar level, which means that the effect of reducing trust in information is more or less similar across different sources of disinformation. We find that what really matters is the domestic division. In other words, partisanship. Recall that the claimer could be a DPP spokesperson or a KMT spokesperson. The respondent could be a pan-blue voter or a pan-green voter. And that's where you see the difference. For example, on the left, you can see that if a claimer is a DPP and you voted in the 2020 election blue, there's not much effect in trust. The effect is negative 0.04, which is almost low effect in reduction in trust. But what if you voted green in the 2020 election? Now you see, you believe in the DPP claimer that something is disinformation, which lowers your trust in the original claim. And vice versa logic for the KMT. KMT people trust KMT claimers more. In other words, pan-blue voters trust that something is disinformation and lowers their trust if the claimer is the KMT spokesperson. So the takeaway over there is that line. Political polarization affects the effect of disinformation claims. All right, so let's move on to general takeaways. How do people respond to disinformation claims? We show that any claim of disinformation significantly lowers the trust in the original article. We want to establish that first. If you want to model the truth, just say that it's disinformation, and that lowers the trust directly. And this holds true for whether the original article is true or not. We varied the story. In the story, we said a presidential candidate killed a child. We changed the issue of the story. All effects hold. We have 3 additional issues in addition to the presidential candidate one. Some issues are true, some issues are false, but the effect remains. The effect of disinformation claim is strongest when the partisanship of the respondent and the claimer aligns. Pan-blue people trust disinformation claims by KMT spokespeople, and DPP voters trust DPP claimants. But the reverse is not true. So this really shows that beliefs in truth can differ by partisanship in the context of Taiwan. Claims about foreign disinformation operations seem to have little effects. We do not find significant effects, showing that domestic divisions weigh more, at least in the context of this study, than foreign source claims. Now, of course, there's the caveat that this is a study in Taiwan, and we are very interested in whether these effects on disinformation claims and political affiliation are also similar in the context in Georgia and in the United States. But nonetheless, the Taiwanese data shows how perceptions of disinformation claims are highly dependent on domestic political divisions. With that, I think I'm out of time. Thanks for attention. I look forward to the Q&A. Thank you.
Finally, we have a recorded presentation from Jesse Liu. We'll be talking about disinformation controversies and solutions in Taiwan.
My name is Chenqi Liu. I came from College of Communication, National Zhenji University. Today, I would like to present a topic about disinformation controversies and solution in Taiwan. We all know disinformation is a traditional issue to be solved, and it threatens the circulation of speech. The audience, misled by absurd propaganda, will have wrong thought and further make an inappropriate judgment. Actually, it damages the public interest and result in democratic failure. In Taiwan, the trend gradually makes people unable to judge which is the correct information or get tired of discussing the truth from disinformation. Or maybe many people just don't care. In the age dominated by technology, the audience is unable to immediately receive correct information. For example, you can see these charts. In Taiwan, the elderly people and the children and the young generation are pretty hard to distinguish what's right, what's wrong in the internet. So in my view, in the new media era, the significance of free speech theories must be clarified and discussed again under the regime of the marketplace of ideas. First, in the digital era, the audience can be confused in the huge amount of information and therefore forced to find useful information which they can receive. Second, in the internet age, the minority's opinion will fade away in information explosion. People's opinions are unable to remain competitive in these speech markets. Moreover, truths are more easily blocked and loses capacity to enter the market. Massive disinformation causes the failure of market competition. Lastly, in my personal perspective, to some extent, the premise that governments has authority to intervene in the speech market under the traditional political framework is not established in the era of the internet and data. So finally, I found people with AI and data-driven technologies have strong power to dominate the market of speech. So basically, I think there are three regulatory models for governments to deal with this information. The first one is content regulation. The second is consumer protection, or maybe you can say information disclosure. The third one is intermediary regulation. So in terms of content regulation, in the model of content regulation, civil, criminal, and administrative liabilities are imposed on creators. It removes or blocks users to prevent the audience from improper content. Therefore, the model of content regulation, which directly intervenes in inappropriate information, is not always allowed in every country. When it comes to information disclosure, platforms are required to disclose sponsorship of content so that user can tell whether the information has government or corporate funds involved. The disclosure reminds user of bias in sponsored content also. So actually, it creates a more transparent information environment. For example, in Taiwan, there is a Taiwan Fact Check Center. This center is a third-party organization that helps citizens check the inappropriate content and deliver true information. It also helps the user to make decisions without intervening of this information. We all know in 2020, the Taiwanese presidential debate, the Taiwan Fact Check Center played a very important role to check the information and help the people in Taiwan to make their own decision in a pretty transparent way. They can get the information in a good way, and they can do their own wise decision. I think this is very important for the democratic society in Taiwan. Also, some private fact-checking group provide some kind of service for the user in the internet and help them to distinguish what is the correct information and what's the wrong information in the presidential debate. So I think this example is very good for us to understand Taiwan has this kind of system and try to help the online user to distinguish this information. And it's a pretty sufficient way to help citizens in Taiwan. The last one, I think, is the most important one for us now, because the intermediary regulation is very important. We all know in 1996, the US Congress has the Communications Decency Act, CDA, reflecting the spirit of net neutrality. Section 230 of the CDA actually shows online platform from liability for the third party. Compared to the CDA in the US under the European legal framework, in recent years, Germany has enacted the Network Enforcement Act. This act tried to let the online platform to monitor and remove content concerning violations of public interest and private interests. So he requires social media to scan the platform for illegal content such as hate speech or defamation and remove them if necessary within 24 hours after receiving a complaint. The new act empowered the government in Germany to punish media companies in breach of duty. In addition, Germany also enacted a new Telemedia Act. This Section 7 is quite similar to the CDA Section 230 in the US. So I think you can say German government also try to adopt the same system from the US and try to put stronger liability on the online platform and try to avoid the disinformation in the internet. Okay, when it comes to Taiwan, Taiwan also tried to promote a new act called Taiwan Digital Communication Act in 2017, but it failed at that time because I think the society doesn't agree. We can use a new law. I mean, establish a new law to regulate this information. But in 2022, I mean this year, the Congress tried to promote this act again, and so actually in Taiwan now we head to a very interesting direction. He seems we try to adopt the US system. We don't create a new law to anti-disinformation. We try to put Article 13 and 15 on this new law to avoid the disinformation by imposing some kind of liability on online service provider. So this kind of system is quite close to the US system, and we also adopt the Molina principles on intermediary liability, and also we try to learn from the German government, and we try to accept the similar concept from the German Telemedia Act. So actually, currently, Taiwanese government try to declare the four principle identity check, block, and liability. And we think these four principles are so important for us and are a key concept we need to watch out and try to deal with the disinformation in our society. In my presentation, I think it's quite necessary we try to clarify some very important points in section 230. You all know section 230 just includes 26 words, but it means a lot to the internet era. In section 230, he clarified no provider or user of an interactive computer service should be treated as the publisher or speaker of any information provided by another information content provider. Before section 230, there's a very important case, prodigy case. The courts try to regulate online platform and try to punish them because they try to circulate some kind of defamation content on the platform. So the court say when the platform has some kind of editorial control, the platform has some kind of knowledge to do some kind of judgment, we can say that the online platform is not just a distributor, he actually become a publisher. So you need to take the responsibility. I think this is very important for the way we consider about the disinformation issues before section 230. After section 230 was established, the court have so many different kind of explanations. I think it's quite important because now the court think we have a broader scope. Any kind of information service or not just interactive computer service can be excluded in section 230, especially in two cases in 2008 and 2009. The court actually say the section 230 not just deal with the problem about defamation, also deal the problem about torts claim. I think this is a pretty broad scope. So now the section 230 can address the issue about or torts issues, not just about defamation. I think this is quite meaningful because it seems the section 230 has stronger function to deal with something, so many issues about disinformation in general. Okay, and here I would like to introduce one very important case in 2008. The case is about U.S. federal government. It's about the act, Fair Housing Act, FHA. He is about an online platform who try to collect the users' data, and they try to let the user can know the landlord's gender, sexual orientation, so they can make their own choices. At the same time, the tenants also has the same function to choose the landlord they want. The landlord has the same right to choose who can rent their houses. But the court actually say when you provide this kind of privacy data, the platform is not just stand in a neutral position. It's more like a co-developer, and maybe in this case, the platform provides some kind of space to let a user put additional comments, but you need to figure out the platform provide this kind of space. The answer can be optional or compulsory. So it means if the online platform enforce the user to fill out the space about additional comments, online platform is more like a co-developer and not in a neutral position. Also, if the online platform has some kind of recommendation function or searching function, so this kind of function is not just ordinary search engine. Maybe is included some kind of discriminatory criteria. So we can say the platform is not a neutral tool anymore. It's more like a co-developer, and also the platform makes some kind of material contribution, and the law should enforce the platform take responsibility. So you can see the function of Section 230 is actually much stronger than in the past when the law just passed in 1996, actually. So here is my conclusion. From my observation, I think intermediary regulation is a very possible new direction for Taiwan, because Taiwan tried to adopt a system in the US, and the system in the US run everything pretty well. And we also adopt the same system from the German government. And I think they use the same approach to use the intermediary regulation to address the disinformation issue. And by creating some kind of new acts similar to Section 230, we can have a law, maybe this kind of law is like speech enhancing statute. It protects the net neutrality. I think this kind of new act can really provide some kind of procedural advantage. So the online platform company can reduce the litigation risk. They can make a decision what kind of business model they want, and they can try to do some kind of legal compliance and try to set up what kind of goal for the company and try to avoid the litigation. So I think it's a pretty good, maybe you can say some kind of minimum standard for them and make their own choice and try to maintain the function of competitive market. Moreover, I think the new acts similar to Section 230 avoids massive social order violation cases in Taiwan. Because Taiwan, in the past, we had martial law, the whole society pretty care about the democracy and the freedom of speech. So I think it's not a good idea. We have so many cases about social order in the courts, and we use this kind of approach to deal with disinformation issue. It's not very good for us, and it's unpredictable and it's unstable for the courts, I think. Okay, and the last point that I would like to raise is judicial interpretation. Maybe it's not a bad way. You can see in the US, they try to use so many cases, and the court try to make so many different kind of explanations and try to clarify some concepts and some vagueness in the Section 230. I think this is quite good because we maintain some kind of due process. We let the court to make a decision. I think this is a very transparent way So I think it's pretty good. So the second point I would like to raise is about, I think online platforms should be a model for the internet society. The online platform promotes the continued development of internet or other interactive computer service and other interactive media. It also preserves the vibrant and competitive free markets that presently existed for the internet and other interactive computer services. I think this is quite good because we let the online platform play a very good role to maintain the competition of the market, and you try to avoid the hate speech or maybe the pornography, children pornography content on the internet. We should let the online platform to be a role model. So the government should not step into the market too seriously and too easily. So I think they'll be better for our society, and it also fits the spirit of net neutrality. So I think this is very important. The last point I would like to raise is about some observation I had from this research. I think now the Section 239 just try to address the issue about defamation. Defamation is some kind of traditional disinformation issue. Now it seems the court tried to make more explanation and try to use the Section 230 to address the harassment issue. It means he tried to broaden the scope of Section 230. I think it's really good. If we can try to clarify the platform, provide any kind of services, so they become a speaker or publisher, or maybe he just a distributor, and I think that's enough. That's very good because we just try to figure out what kind of function the online platform provides, and maybe it become a co-developer or maybe just some kind of open-ended service. We just need to figure out if the online platform stand in a very neutral position. And also you can see from the court's decision, we also use the standard about material contribution or functional platforms to distinguish the platform is a publisher, speaker, or just a distributor. I think that's enough because we already provide a very good standard to let the company to make their own decision, and at the same time safeguard the net neutrality. So I think the 3 points are very important for me when I do so many case studies. I found this is very important for Taiwan, and maybe in the future we should think about that. We should try to get more experiences from the US or maybe the Germany, and we can figure out a direction for Taiwanese society. So this is my presentation. I'm really pleased to be here and share my thought with you. In the future, if you have any questions, please feel free to send me an email and I will reply you soon. And I think in the near future, we will have more opportunity to meet up and maybe share our thoughts, and I can learn more from you.
I want to invite the panelists that are here in person to come up to the stage, and then we will start the Q&A portion. Jesse's not online, right? No. Okay. All right. Okay. Great. Well, first of all, I was, especially struck by the 3 presentations that we had for all of their relevance to a lot of the contemporary policy issues that I think, as a think tank focused on Taiwan, we are grappling with concerning Taiwan. Even the first presentation concerning Czechoslovakia, and perhaps it's not unknown for many of you in the audience, but it's often said that history does not repeat, but it often rhymes. And I think we're seeing signatures of those rhythms playing out currently with regards to Russia-China propaganda. And I thought it was fascinating about how during that period of time that you studied, and during the Cold War, it was largely Moscow-directed type of information operations on Czechoslovakia. But now we're sort of evolved. That relationship has reconstituted itself, but it evolved in such a manner of speaking where now Russia and China are cooperating, not through the necessary of the third-party communist parties in these societies, but through commercial, arrangements and the media companies of those respective countries in China and Russia, and then spreading propaganda outside on Taiwan. So I think regarding Taiwan and regarding their national interests, and so I think there's a great deal of contemporary relevance to seeing how that relationship was first constituted and the means by which they engaged in. And I'm kind of curious to see if there were outside this, or the I know this is outside the scope of your study, but beyond the communist papers, right? Were there other sort of channels by which the two sides cooperated to work on spreading propaganda? But anyways, I don't know if there's questions in the audience that people want to, because I don't want to monopolize the time here. I want people in the audience to ask their questions. Okay, why don't we? Oh yeah, that's a good point. Yeah, maybe if you could answer the question first, and then I'll invite the audience to ask other questions.
All right.
Yeah.
All right. Thank you.
Yeah, please. Yeah, you can come up over here actually.
Sorry. Yeah. Thank you, Russell, for your comments. Yes, actually, there were quite a lot of other propaganda channels that were used, but obviously, I didn't have time in the presentation to go into them. What I'm doing right now, and I plan to do in the future, is not only I would like to create a database of those propaganda posters, and because we probably all know quite well the ChinesePosters.net webpage, which is very helpful for studying Chinese history. So hopefully in the future, I will be able to create something like that for Czechoslovak propaganda posters, and maybe with, later on with other countries, so we can do the comparison. And what were the other channels besides the nice propaganda posters were political education. I mean, the same thing that every authoritarian regime does. So I'm actually doing interviews with people who lived through the late 40s and early 50s. Obviously, many of them are not alive anymore, but those who are actually, especially in the late 40s and through the 50s, Taiwan and the history of Taiwan, and generally Chiang Kai-shek and Kuomintang was something that showed up in their political education, usually at least once a month. I can go a little bit deeper if you want into the political education, how it worked, but I do not think that we actually have the time for that. So, but if any of you is interested, I will be very happy to share it through emails or during the coffee break. And I will definitely like to hear from other countries how it worked. And besides that, actually, Chiang Kai-shek even made it to the textbooks, not only on a geographical level, but there were even math cases for kids to count if you have this amount of KMT soldiers and you have this amount of Chinese communist soldiers, what you have to do, how fast they walk, blah, blah, blah. So they kind of, made it a math problem, but it was something, subconsciously sending messages through many different channels. Yeah, okay. Thank you.
Okay, so again, show of hands again, who has questions? Okay, great. Karis, why don't you come up over here first and ask a question? Very quick.
All right, so I've got questions for both Lev and for Yan Xiao. So for Lev, great project. I'm interested to see how it develops. If I understand your argument right, one implication of the finding that there's not a real kind of salient response in Taiwanese protest activity and by implication public opinion or voting behavior, in military flights around Taiwan. And I'm wondering if there is a more, I don't know how to put this, if there's an attack, let's say on Ituaba, or there's something that actually does impose some real costs on Taiwanese everyday life, a blockade, something that causes a financial crisis, whether that would then break through and produce a similar kind of reaction. Is that a fair implication of your argument? And then related, well, sort of related, is the Hong Kong protests of 2019. What's your evaluation of where those fit in this kind of three-part type of threat? Do Taiwanese, did those break through? Did they affect not only protest behavior, but public opinion and voting, or are they somewhere in between? So I'd be interested in your thoughts on that. And then for Yan Xiao, I just invite you to comment on the assertion here that Taiwan Fact Check organization actually played an important role in countering disinformation. And your evidence suggests that there is people in your experiment, when they saw that this claim of disinformation had been put forth by an NGO or a journalistic organization like Taiwan Fact Check, they actually discounted it more. Is that a general phenomenon? Do you think that generalizes beyond the experiment that you did? So thanks.
Thank you so much, Cars, for the questions. Yeah, what makes threats in places like Taiwan or contested states so interesting is that when they never really follow up, it shows kind of how we never really are able to understand how people would feel in the event of an actual attack. And what would an actual attack response from civil society be like? I have no idea. And I think that's one of the biggest puzzles. And I think there's a lot of people looking at Ukraine and trying to make that comparison to say, well, if this is how civil society reacted in Ukraine, then Taiwan civil society will react similarly. I don't fully sign on to that comparison. But I do think that there's something to be said about, kind of differentiating between the military threats that we've seen on Taiwan over the decades and the responses to that being a thing, and then what an actual attack would look like, and the responses definitely being qualitatively different between those two. In terms of the Hong Kong protests and how they impacted Taiwanese public opinion, was that the question? So I have survey work on how Taiwanese people felt about the protests and can say exactly how Taiwanese people felt. So there's kind of two different dimensions to how we looked at the impact of Hong Kong protests on Taiwanese public opinion. There's the kind of symbolic support. So being able to say, like, do you support the Hong Kong protests? And then there's the second dimension, which looks at policy support. So do you support policy that helps Hong Kongers? And what we find is that overwhelmingly, there is symbolic support across parties for Hong Kong. When it comes to policy, however, that support very much varies in the sense that there is not unanimous support for Hong Kong policy. And why that is currently an ongoing project because we're trying to better understand the kind of limits and understanding of solidarity between Taiwan and Hong Kong. But what we do know for sure is that when the Hong Kong protests were going on, Taiwanese civil society was able to look at that and say, wow, that really sucks. We feel really bad for them. But whether or not we need to do something about it, I think is not a very clear, unified thing in Taiwan. I'll stop there.
Thank you, Karis, for that question. This highlights the idea that I completely agree with you that Taiwan Fact Check and sources like Taiwan Fact Check can counter disinformation, because by pointing out that something is disinformation, it lowers the confidence in the original information. But beyond that, there's also the side of weaponry that I was mentioning earlier in my presentation, because what we found is that this effect of lowering trust not only holds like for NGOs like Taiwan Fact Check, It also holds for newspapers. It also holds for partisan sources. And if we take that into account, it seems that any kind of disinformation claim has the effect of lowering people's trust. And that is very concerning for democracies, because that shows that even if you are a dubious source, as long as you wield claims of disinformation, people get confused, people lower trust, and whether that original information is true or false, that effect holds. And I think that is the biggest takeaway for democracy with these kind of weaponry uses of disinformation claims. Yeah, thanks.
Get a show of hands for questions. Okay, the lady over there on the right. Yes, please. Yeah. Okay. This way that our online audience can also hear. Yeah.
Hi, everyone, and the speakers. I am Rita from UT Austin and NTU. So I have questions for each of the speakers, and I'll go real fast. So for Dr. Halbertova. So my question is, I think your project is really, really interesting, but I'm wondering, because the materials are from, the 40s and 50s, of course, all the way to the 80s. Do you have like data about generation, our younger generation in 20s and 30s? Is there like a generational attitude shift, especially with the rise of China's, pop culture influence, economic influence, and political influence? Do you see like a different, perception about Taiwan now in the country study? And Dr. Nachman, did I pronounce that right? Just a question about, because I really like your observation that, right, the domestic co-optation is the biggest threat, right? But that is like external factor. Without that, like, is there still like a momentum for civil society to go on? Especially now we're in the DPP's second term, right? Second term. And in Taiwan's NGO, now like people joke about this is like a dead period, right? Because you don't have the big enemy to fight, right? And then it's really hard if you criticize the DPP government, because once you do that, they allow you're the KMT friends, like 中共同路人. So it puts the civil society in a very awkward position, because their eternal enemy is gone, and now they don't know who to fight. And there seems to be a complacency, which is very awkward. So I'm just wondering, how do we do that without the external threat? Because we don't know when that's going to happen, and we don't want that to happen. And for Dr. Xiao, right? So with your project, I'm just wondering, what should we do about it, right? Because we all know a lot about disinformation, misinformation, but I think right now we see a lot of descriptive studies, analysis, and I think your study is such an important step forward. But I'm just wondering, what's your take on what do we do? And I actually have a burning question about net neutrality, but our speaker is not here. So if anyone knows anything about net neutrality, I would love to have a conversation about it. Thank you.
I'm going to exercise the chair's authority here and actually ask the lady who has a question to please come up and ask your question, so that we can take all the questions at once and then close out the session. Okay, please.
Okay, well, first of all, I would like to appreciate all the presenters here for your excellent and informational research and the presentation. I just have a short question for Dr. Xiao. I think your research is interesting and well designed by critical factors were included and considered. But my question is that is your sample knew the resource of the news at the first stage? Because according to your presentation, your sample seems to know the resource at the second stage by the claimer. If they knew the resource at the first stage, do you think the result might be a lot of different? Okay, that's my question.
Thank you. All right, please.
Thank you for a very interesting question. I will try to cover it very quickly. So because the propaganda targeted every generation within the society pupils through the textbooks, teenagers and young adults through the cartoons, and older people or those who weren't able to spend much time reading through political education at the workplace, then obviously it had an impact on the population. But my preliminary results right now is that actually it didn't create certain attitude towards Taiwan in general. It just created this huge amount of propaganda. It just created a knowledge about Taiwan, something like, yeah, it's geographically there, and there is some kind of issue. And I think this kind of nicely connects with Dr. Xiao, which is that through the decades, people kind of stopped believing the propaganda. They knew it was there, but they didn't believe the informations they were provided. So when I'm trying to do interviews with different generations of witnesses who experienced this kind of propaganda, they just felt like, well, we didn't care. It was there. We knew about Taiwan, but we didn't care that much because there was no way to somehow, connect it to anything else and experience Taiwan itself. But what it resulted into later on, and that might be interesting for contemporary research more, that from the statistical data I have so far, but I need to double check because this is really just area where I'm aiming to, that, for example, people in Czechoslovakia, students of sinology tend to apply for Taiwanese scholarship nowadays much more than they are doing to People's Republic of China, comparing when we have the amount of students willing to go to study Mandarin abroad. And it's simply because they are aware about Taiwan. And I'm sure that plenty of you experienced the same thing when you announced that you're going to Taiwan and you were originally living in Europe or maybe in the US, that not so many people knew exactly where Taiwan was and what was the Taiwanese issue. But that's not the case in Czech Republic and Slovakia, compared, for example, with Poland or German students, especially in the 90s and early 2000s. They knew about Taiwan, and from the beginning they were applying for the scholarship in larger numbers. Thank you.
Want to encourage our presenters to be a little bit more brief about their responses too as well. Thank you.
Very quickly, I think that there's definitely a lot to be said about the status of social movements under Tsai Ing-wen today. I think, part of my argument is that you need a critical threat of domestic co-optation threat to see mobilization, and we just don't see that under Tsai Ing-wen. And I think it's just not conducive for social movement mobilization at this moment. I think there's a broader conversation to be had about when the state is contested, its inability for that kind of fundamental cleavage to grow beyond, for civil society to be able to mobilize beyond issues of contestation, because everything gets swept into these issues. We saw that during the referendums with something like the environmental movements, but we can talk more later. Thank you.
Could I answer the shorter question first? What if people knew the source of information in the first stage, saying that a Russian newspaper says XYZ, or a Chinese newspaper says XYZ? So honestly, we don't know, but we will speculate that already discounts people's trust in disinformation. And what we wanted to study in this specific study is, if people believe in something, can disinformation claims alter that belief in truth? And we show that there are those effects. But we don't know, because I think that's a great idea to design an additional study where people know the source at the first stage. All right, now the big question: what should we do? And that's a that's a very difficult question. And there are many studies, and I have a whole lecture on that. The idea, I would just point out two things. One is to stop the diffusion of disinformation claims that are not true. So once exposed, people see the effect. So the question is, can we stop the spread of these disinformation claims via, algorithm changes, via interventions by governments, which was one of the presentations. So stopping the diffusion is one of the strategies. The other strategy is counter speech, which is kind of controversial because there are also backfire effects in the literature. But in general, I think the field of political science is leaning towards that correction does have an effect, especially went from trusted sources. So getting trusted sources to back into debunking the false disinformation claims, as worthy as that seems, might be one of the ways to move forward. All right, I'll stop here.
Wonderful, and thanks. Please join me in giving a round of applause to all our presenters. That brings this session to a close. Thank you.